She formerly served as lead researcher for Enterprise Africa, a research project on enterprise-based solutions to poverty. She also served as a member of the faculty at the George Mason School of Law and served on the working group on property rights and the UN's Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor. Now, Karol came to this interesting career in a very roundabout fashion. So if you're a student, raise your hand if you're wondering what you're going to do with your life. Everybody, even some faculty raised their hands. Now, Karol's work demonstrates that get into something meaningful and important through even a roundabout fashion. She was an English lit major.
It's true.
Summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa, so she worked hard. She went on to get her law degree from UVA. She was then a lecturer in legal studies at Clemson before going on to do some graduate work in history at the University of Georgia. Then she became a program director for the Foundation for Economic Education at Irvington-on-Hudson in New York. Now, in the parlance of economists, institutions are the rules of the game. And changing the rules of the game is very difficult, as you would imagine, because of all the vested interests who gain from the status quo. And in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith lamented the lingering property rights rules that predominated in many parts of Europe in his day. And that institution that he was sad about or lamenting was primogeniture, where all of the inheritance goes to the oldest son. This was done for political and security reasons, but Adam Smith complained that long after there was any rationale for doing so, societies continued with this cultural tradition, even though it hurt economic and social development by keeping land and capital out of the hands of those who might be most productive with it. Karol Boudreaux is likewise working on the front lines of trying to change institutions, that is, property right rules in Africa, in ways that promote the capabilities and rights of women and the poor. She's been willing to tackle hard issues of social justice and redistribution, such as interpaper land reform and social justice, the case of South Africa, where Boudreaux examines the tensions of government redistribution and the quiet reforms going on in the private market sector. And I think she paints a more hopeful future for the African continent. Please join me in welcoming Karol Boudreaux to the University of Richmond.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan, very much. I'm just amazed that so many people were willing to join us on a Friday afternoon at 4:30. So thank you all so much for being here. What a pleasure it is to be at the University of Richmond. I've never visited here before. And I'm really honored to be here at the Jepson Center and the John Marshall Center to be speaking with you this evening. I'm going to have two caveats, sort of towards the beginning of the discussion. My first caveat is that what the insights, the thoughts, the conversations that we'll be having this evening do not necessarily reflect the opinions, thoughts of the United States Agency for International Development. They reflect my own thoughts and ideas. And I'll get to my second caveat in just a moment. So we're going to be talking tonight about Africa. I'm looking around the room to see if we have many souls here with us from Africa. It's a great topic, and I hope that you'll learn something new that you weren't aware of before by the end of the conversation. So this is really what we're used to. I think, at least most Americans, this is what we're used to when we think about Africa. We have a set of visions in our mind about a place where conditions of living are really very difficult, where there are significant levels of poverty, where people are really suffering as a result of not having access to things like clean water and reasonable sanitation, where employment and other kinds of economic opportunities are pretty seriously limited, as a result of which people live with very few opportunities to pursue their own dreams and goals. They're less able to flourish than are in the western part of the world, and where there are significant levels of conflict. We rarely think of Africa, although some of us may. Like, we could have the David Attenborough view of Africa, that it's all about the animals and the savannah and the beauties of the natural world. And maybe some of that filters out or lessens a little bit some of the difficulties of the more traditional view that most of us probably have in our mind. But I think it's probably fair to say that when we do think about this enormously large continent, this extraordinarily varied place, what we think about are mostly negatives and mostly not positives. And to a certain extent, that's absolutely right and continues to be the case today. So today, for example, if you were to look at what's the key news story coming out of Africa this afternoon, it would by far be the Somali drought. This is a really desperate situation in the Horn of Africa that's going on today, and it's echoing the sorts of famines that we've seen in the early 1990s, repeatedly, almost 1960s. And just in case you're not keeping up with let me give you just a few of the really stark statistics that are associated with this ongoing event. Figures this week coming out from both the United States government and from the United Nations are saying that over 13 million people are in need of assistance right now. I just want to stop because 13 million people is a heck of a lot of people. That's really bad. That means 13 million people in Kenya, eastern and southern Ethiopia need help getting food. And the problem in Somalia is that we can't get food to these people. This is the area that's been hit the hardest, South Somalia. We, the United States government, can't get food to South Somalia because the Al-Shabaab terrorist organization operates in South Somalia. And it makes it very difficult. Actually, we're legally prohibited from delivering food directly into that area. And so the people who are most in need of food are having an exceptionally difficult time getting access to food that a variety of donors are supplying to try to meet the needs of these people. So here we are. It's basically October. We're just a couple of weeks away from October. This famine situation has been going on for several months now, and rains are about to start. The spring rains failed in Somalia. The autumn rains are about to start, and you might think this is a good thing because now crops will grow and the animals will actually be able to be fed because grass will grow. In fact, it's a disaster. The rains are going to come into the area. They've already started in some places. Some areas are already flooding because the grounds are so parched. And what's going to happen is there's going to be significant problems of waterborne diseases that are going to affect people in the area who are already weak from not having eaten well for months. Figures this morning said that there's a good chance that upwards of 750,000 people, mostly children under the age of 5, and older people, and then some women, are going to starve to death. Think about that in today's world. We live in a world that's filled with plenty, and there's a not unreasonable chance that we're actually going to be hearing news stories over the next couple of months that hundreds of thousands of people have starved to death in an area of the world where we actually could get food if it were a little easier institutionally to operate. But that's the whole point. It's not easy institutionally to operate in this part of the world. And in fact, the reason why you're used to seeing the sort of pictures that were on the previous slide is because so many of the institutions in the continent, so many of the institutions that we take for granted don't operate the same way, can't operate the same way, for some of the reasons Jonathan was pointing out, because there are vested interests on the ground who want to keep the property rights environment unstable or insecure, or who want to ensure that trade isn't freer because they benefit from having a more restricted trade environment, or who don't want to provide press freedoms and other sort of civil liberties because they benefit when they can control access to the media, access to the airwaves. And so a large part of the problem in Africa is not some murky, oh, they must be poor, something bad has happened. It's largely an institutional story, a story about what wasn't working institutionally. And that helps us understand why some of those pictures are so common when we talk about Africa. But I'm pretty much done with the bad stuff. Because what's really exciting to someone like me is that over the past 10 years, very quietly, kind of under the radar until pretty recently, there's been a real change, a real transformation in much of sub-Saharan Africa. I should say maybe like a little a little interjection. I work entirely in Sub-Saharan Africa. I don't work in North Africa at all. And so the Arab Spring that's been going on for a number of months now is terrific. It's a wonderful expression of a demand for freedom, but it's not an area where I work, so I will, with hesitance, take questions on that issue. But what's really encouraging are the sorts of things that you see on the slide here. Again, really over the course of about a decade now, very interesting things have been going on in Africa. So if you look around Sub-Saharan Africa, that part of the continent, what would you see? I'll just highlight a couple of these things for you. One of the things you'd see is that countries overall are carrying less debt. Something that, would be good for the United States to be thinking about too. But they're lowering their debt levels, they're paying down debts. Countries like Nigeria actually paid off their international debt a couple of years ago using oil reserve money. But that paying off of debt makes it easier then for governments to use the revenues that they are generating and are capturing to do things like provide desperately needed services for their citizens. So it's a terrific thing that debt levels are coming down in Africa, but it's also an absolutely wonderful thing for the citizens on the ground that inflation rates have been coming down on average all across this part of the continent. And so whereas maybe 10 years ago the average inflation rate was up around 22%, today the average inflation rate around Sub-Saharan Africa is plus or minus 8%. It's like you just got a great big tax relief from your government when when inflation rates lower, when governments are more prudent with their taxing and fiscal policies. So for people on the ground, what it translates into is having more money in your pocket. Really important. So what do you do when you have more money in your pocket and you're poor? You do things like buy shoes for your kids, send your children to school, actually take them to a medical clinic, buy more protein, have more protein in your diet. It makes a real difference for people who are very poor to have $200 a year to spend as opposed to having $100 a year to spend. And the other thing I want to highlight is there actually is less conflict across the area today than there was 10 years ago. A lot of the conflict in Sub-Saharan Africa is related in some way, shape, or form to land issues or to property issues. If you think about the conflicts that are going on right now, and you think about recent conflicts, the conflict in Darfur, people may characterize as an ethnic or religious conflict between Arab northerners in Sudan and black animists in the southern part of Sudan. And certainly that was a fairly clear distinction in that particular conflict. But that's also a conflict at its heart about access to fertile land. It's about herders who need to move their animals from one season's pasture from a dry season pasture to a wet season pasture and migrate to get between the areas. It's a dispute about those folks being in conflict with settled farmers who move into new areas as fighting sends them scurrying from one part of the country to another. And similar sorts of problems are happening, say, all across the Sahel region, which is the area just south of the Sahara. A lot of the violence in Nigeria that is touted as being between Muslims and Christians is really at base also about access to land. It's a very screwy land environment in Nigeria. And so what's interesting is you're getting these changes at what we'd call the macro level. Changes to the macro economy of a lot of sub-Saharan African countries that are having really important implications for folks at the micro level, that is within people's households. And this process is just gathering steam. It's going forward despite some of the financial crises that we've been suffering through in the Western world, maybe even in spite of some of those crises. African economies continue to grow at pretty robust rates. They had been growing at about 5% per annum up until last year. This year it may be down a little bit. But that's pretty good. That's pretty good growth rates. It's certainly much higher than we're going to have in the United States this year. Having said that, though, remember these countries were starting from a really low beginning place, so the bar was low. For them to catch up with us is going to take lots of years of good, robust, sustained growth over time. But what's so encouraging is that these growth rates are twice as high as they were 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, when Africa really went back It wasn't moving forward in the 80s and 90s. It was actually moving back, losing ground, becoming poorer and poorer, citizens having less and less resources to work with. I've already talked about there being less conflict on the ground, but less conflict means that people can do business in different kinds of ways, and this is really important because what you're seeing all across sub-Saharan Africa, if you read the papers, if you look at trade magazines, if you're reading things like The Economist, sometimes The Economist is focused on some of the bad stuff, what you'll see is there's a revolution going on in sub-Saharan Africa. We'll talk a little bit about some of the manifestations of this in a few moments, but there is a revolution that's being promoted by access to technology. There are all sorts of fascinating entrepreneurial innovations that are being developed, created, spread across the subcontinent because it's much easier basically to do business now than it was in the past. It's easier, it's less costly. If we want to think about it in a leadership sense, and it would be appropriate here to do that, so what happened? So we had some good leadership from African leaders who focused on improving the climate for doing business in their countries. And then we had something else, I'd argue, that's really important. I don't know how much you guys talk about this, but I think it's actually really essential in an African context and in other developing world contexts. That we had a lot of policy entrepreneurship. There are a lot of unsung heroes within ministries all around sub-Saharan Africa who pushed through regulatory reforms, legislative reforms, who got rid of barriers to doing business, who lowered costs of doing business, and who in turn have made it easier for the citizens in their country to live healthier, more prosperous lives. And we won't ever know the names of those folks, right? They're assistant minister so-and-so in the Bureau of Trade in some country. But they're really playing a key role in terms of changing the face of Africa today. So where are things improving? You might think, well, yeah, growth rates in Africa are getting better, but that's all explained by the extractive industry sector. That's all explained by countries like Equatorial Guinea, little country on the Atlantic coast of Africa, that has seen huge, enormous economic growth rates, 15, 20% over the past couple of years, all because they've got significant oil reserves and are exploiting those oil reserves. But that's not the case. In fact, where we're seeing a lot of interesting change are in sectors like the banking sector. Banking sector is dynamic in sub-Saharan Africa. There are millions, hundreds of millions actually, of unbanked potential customers in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you are a commercial bank and you can figure out how do I reach those folks, you've got a potentially enormous market you can tap into because the unbanked, the poor, have significant financial needs. For those of you who have any interest in this, I highly recommend a book called The Portfolios of the Poor that looks very carefully at financial diaries poor people kept in South Africa and India and examines how it is that they go through a very complex, sophisticated decision-making strategy in order to get from month to month. Yes, sir? Portfolios of the Poor. I think it came out in 2009. Really terrific. 2 enthusiastic thumbs up, in fact. So the banking sector is kind of exploding, doing really cool, interesting things. Construction, everywhere I travel, there are cranes, there are things being built, there's scaffolding. It's a little scary sometimes because the scaffolding is oftentimes bamboo and we're not used to that. So I'm always kind of worrying things are going to fall down. But there's tons of construction going on. Some of it's informal, maybe most of it's actually informal construction, i.e. not the building codes of a particular environment, which may turn out to be a problem later on, but it is providing lots of employment opportunities for folks on the ground. And the retail sector also growing. So what does this tell you if the retail sector is expanding? Right? It's stores. This means stores are hiring people, doing more business because people have more money. The retail sector wouldn't be expanding if people on the ground didn't have more money to spend. But what's really exciting in sub-Saharan Africa, the place where there's just been tremendous growth, is the telecom sector. If you have a cell phone in sub-Saharan Africa, it's almost certainly better than my iPhone. It can do more interesting things than my iPhone can. And you can switch the SIM cards in and out in all sorts of really interesting ways that I can't do with my phone. I'm a slave to the iPhone. It's really irritating. But there's this great, incredible entrepreneurial fervor in sub-Saharan Africa around the expansion of a brand new technology, cell phone technology. Most Africans, until really the last 5 years, did not have access they certainly didn't have access to landlines. There weren't landlines. Governments had not put them in. They had only put them into wealthy communities. So anyone who wasn't a wealthy urban elite did not have a phone. Only 10 years ago was the legal environment changed so that virtually all the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, not all of them, but virtually all of them, liberalized the business sector that is telecom and allowed for competition in this area so that the landlines, the government-held monopoly to distribute telephone services, was broken open, leading to a real explosion of interests in this kind of communications form. And so now you see really interesting apps all across sub-Saharan Africa. Some of them for-profit, some of them not-for-profit. A not-for-profit example would be Google Labs, which is not based in Africa, but has made this very nice application that provides agricultural extension service knowledge to farmers via the cell phone. So if you're, let's say you're a maize farmer in Uganda, and you want to know when should I plant, how much fertilizer should I be putting on my crops, where's the best place I can go to get more information about the maize industry, Google will send you that. You can sign up for this Google app and it'll be sent to you automatically. There are very cool new apps for dealing with HIV/AIDS problems. So if you're a person living with HIV/AIDS in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, you can sign up for an app that will actually send you reminders about when to take your meds and when to show up for your clinic visits, and you can reschedule your clinic visits using these apps. So those are just a couple of examples. We'll talk about some more examples just right now. And these are all, except with one exception, all based in Kenya. There is so much dynamism in Kenya right now. If you were an American investor and you were willing to bear a little bit of risk, it's a risky environment in a bunch of ways, this is definitely the place to go. Let me talk to you for a few moments. Some of you may be familiar with M-Pesa. M-Pesa is a mobile money business that didn't exist in 2005 and today has over 13 million customers and expanding away from Kenya. So what does mobile money mean? Mobile money means that folks who are unbanked but who have a cell phone can go to a little kiosk. There are 16,000 of these kiosks around Kenya. You can go up to a kiosk and you can buy a card. Do you know how to top up is anyone familiar with topping up technologies? So you buy a little card that's worth so much money. And the little card, you pay for it, and then the little card basically deposits money into your cell phone. And when you want to pay someone, you send a little SMS text with a code to their cell phone. As soon as they receive the cell phone message from your phone, you go to another M-Pesa kiosk and say, look, I just got this text from Carol. She's sending me 2,000 Kenyan shillings. Will you please pay me? And you'll be paid right there, right then. You don't have to go to a commercial bank. You don't have to have a form of identification. For many people living in informal settlements, they do not have identity cards. They don't have utility bills because the utilities don't come to the slums. But they do have a cell phone. 60% of Kenyans have cell phones today. Less than 20%, however, have identification. So for these folks, they couldn't open a banking account, but they can use M-Pesa, which means what? It means they can do business faster, they can do business more cheaply, they don't have to carry cash around in their pockets anymore, which can be a very dangerous thing in Washington, D.C., let alone in some other parts of the developing world. So especially nice for women who don't have to worry if you're a female entrepreneur doing business, you don't have to worry about carrying a bunch of cash around with you anymore. But what's so cool about this, I think, is how it's spreading like wildfire. This business model, again, only started in 2006, and today, with over 13 million customers, has spread into Tanzania and is looking to spread into West Africa. And again, a very interesting example of folks seeing what are the needs in an environment where there are lots of poor people. How can we meet those needs and at the same time create a viable and sustainable business? The next example that is listed up there is Ushahidi. Is anyone familiar with Ushahidi? I'm going to actually step down and get my water. Okay, so you got to Google Ushahidi because it's so cool. This is a crowdsourcing site that was developed in Kenya to track violence during the 2007 presidential elections in that country. And so Ushahidi was developed by software engineers in Nairobi. Again, is open source crowdsourcing software, so can be modified by anyone in the world to meet the needs that you might have to track something that's going on in real time. So it's been used in the United States to track crime in Atlanta. I can imagine using it, say, to track land disputes. If I needed to work in an environment where there's a lot of land disputes, could be in Uganda, someplace like that. I, as a government, I might adopt that particular software. I couldn't do it, actually. Maybe the 14-year-old son could do it. But would work with someone to adopt that software to track in real time where conflicts are springing up so that we could identify where would we best use our limited resources. And this has been spreading all around the world because there's such a multiplicity of uses for it. And then finally, the example I think I really like the best of all is the example of EcoTact. So EcoTact is, the picture up in the corner is an EcoTact eco-toilet. So I want you to think about I want you to think for a minute about living in an informal slum somewhere in the developing world. It's going to be hard for you to do, but if you've ever seen pictures of these slums, what they look like is people on top of people living in very small shacks, sometimes corrugated metal, sometimes not even corrugated metal, maybe some cinder blocks if you're lucky, very crowded conditions, and basically no services. The government is not providing water in most of these slum areas. The government is certainly not providing sewer systems in these areas. The government is almost certainly not providing electricity, though people may be stealing electricity from existing lines. Maybe there's some electricity, but very little. There usually are not that many schools in these areas, and they're only the kinds of health clinics that are there are probably run by NGOs or charitable organizations. So it's an area where people are kind of left on their own to deal with things on their own. So a couple of years ago, in 2007, the man who started EcoTact was really worried because the female members of his family, when they needed to go to the bathroom, had to go outside to use the bathroom. And if they had to go outside at night, it was dangerous. And so they had to have someone accompany them. And even then, sometimes you would be robbed when you went outside to use the bathroom. And when I say they went outside to use the bathroom, unfortunately, in the area where they were living, they went outside. And there wasn't a facility for them. So there was a problem of human waste being out of doors, and then when it rained, being flushed, washed into river systems, et cetera. So a very, very unhealthy environment. So what did the founder of EcoTact do? He started building toilets, clean toilets around Nairobi. He built these facilities inside of which are toilets, showers, spigots to get water out so you can fill up a can with water. They all have attached services with them. So every eco-toilet has a little tiny grocery store. Sometimes they have ATM machines. Sometimes they have shoe shines. They have a variety of different services. They're clean. They're well lit. They play music. There's always sort of cheerful music going on in the eco-toilets. And people pay for them. Every time you go into an eco-toilet, it costs the equivalent of 7 cents. Last year, there were 6 million people, or 6 million visitors to eco-toilets in Kenya, in Nairobi, and it's expanded out now. This year, they're on track to have over 10 million visits to the eco-toilets. So each one of the eco-toilets is supposed to be an economically self-sustaining business model. This model has been so successful that the man who started the business has not only won prizes from organizations like the Acumen Fund and Ashoka Changemakers, he was named the United Nations Innovator of the Year last year for thinking about how can I solve the water and sanitation problems of people who are living in slums, because it's not happening through the private sector. The private sector didn't have a whole lot of incentives to go into those difficult areas and service those people. and they weren't getting serviced. Unless it was your ethnic group that was in that area, you were probably not going to have a government service provided to you. I guess the final thing to say, some of you may or may not be aware of this, but you think Africa isn't changing? Walmart is in Africa. Walmart bought a 51% share of Massmart in South Africa this past year. They said, they were making a bet saying, we think the African markets are going to continue to grow. We want to be there. We want to be a part of what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. And there are some legal issues around whether the deal is going to go through exactly as it was planned. But I think that's a remarkable vote of confidence to have America's Walmart go into South Africa with the expectation that it's going to spread throughout Southern Africa pretty quickly. Okay, so there are a bunch of important trends that are going on in sub-Saharan Africa today. I'll only talk about one or two of these, the most important of which is probably the trend to urbanization. Africa is rapidly urbanizing, rapidly. It'll be 50% of the population will be living in cities in Africa. Let's see, I think the expectation is by like 2017 or something like that. So, cities have their challenges. I was just talking about living in informal settlements. But cities are these wonderful, vibrant, dynamic places also where people are looking at each other, trying to figure out what are new market opportunities. And so having a growing urban sector in sub-Saharan Africa is actually a pretty cool thing, I think. Maybe the other interesting thing to talk about is that Africa is increasingly becoming integrated into the world economy. It's by far the least integrated region of the world for a variety of different reasons still, but it is rapidly sending more and more of its products abroad and bringing more products in. And not only primary agricultural commodities or things like mineral wealth, but increasingly slowly manufactured goods as well. So those are some of the important trends that when I look at sub-Saharan Africa, I see going on. Also really interesting, the diaspora is going back. I live near DC. There's a huge Ethiopian diaspora in DC. Significant Somali diaspora. Many Somalis are out in Milwaukee though. But if you get into a cab in DC, 9 times out of 10 you're going to have someone from Ethiopia driving you around. And if you're up in DC and you take a cab ride, talk to your cabbie. Because it's always really interesting to hear what they have to say. And part of what they're saying is not only are they sending money back in terms of remittances, they send money to friends and family back at home. And sort of just another bracket comment. How many of you think that, let me think about how to phrase this. I'll just phrase it this way. Each year, the United States spends about $36 billion in official development assistance all around the developing world. Each year, remittances going to the developing world are this past year, the most recent year, 90 billion. Swamping official development. Remittances swamp official development assistance. In other words, private individuals give vastly more in a kind of direct aid to their friends and family than governments do to support development in other parts of the world. So the diaspora is helping to transform Africa by sending more and more remittances home. People who are living in other parts of the world make money, they send it home. But they're also going back, which is a very cool thing. As the situation improves on the ground in Africa, people who've been educated in other countries take their human capital, bring it back to their homelands, bring innovative ideas, new understandings about how to do business, new understandings about how to create viable market linkages to their home countries, which continues to feed into this. It's probably too early to call it a virtuous circle, but feeds into these improvements that we're seeing across the subcontinent. Okay, so just a few moments about regional trade. I had mentioned that global trade integration is expanding. At the same time, in different regions of Africa, you're seeing more and more regional integration. It's especially evident in East Africa, where the East African community is a pretty robust group. There's been some talk about creating something like a United States of Africa, and Mr. Gaddafi was very enthusiastic about that idea. Not clear what's going to happen there. But there is a sort of movement to create 3 major regional trading blocs in Africa: the ECOWAS in West Africa, the EAC in East Africa, and then SADC in Southern Africa. And so when you have these regional trading blocs, the cost of doing business for bloc members goes down, and that also makes it easier for people to do business in those areas. Another really encouraging development. And we're seeing regional specialization. So Southern Africa, for example, South Africa is a terrific producer of agricultural products, especially things like fruits, processed fruits, as well as a variety of different grains and other sorts of things. And the South Africans are increasingly trading to other Southern African countries, not just trading to the West. It's a very good development for the Africans. And so all these good developments lead to what? It leads to a growing middle class. And we might think about Africa as one of those environments where there are a few wealthy people and everybody else is poor, most of whom are desperately poor. But the encouraging news is that there is a growing middle class in sub-Saharan Africa. They're the people who have more disposable income. They're the people who help us understand why there's a boom in the retail sector. Interestingly, does anyone know what the population of Africa is? Anyone want to take a guess? About 8, go ahead. No, go ahead. You finish.
I was going to say 700 million.
Yeah, so about 800 million, between 750 and 800 million people. So actually, it's a huge continent and lots of countries, 53 countries, but more middle-class households than India. So very encouraging, I think, to see the growth of the middle class. And I think this has important reasons or important correlations to institutional changes as well. And so what we're seeing in the next slide, I apologize, I don't have the source reference here, but this is from a paper by Bill Easterly from, I think, 2 years ago. And if anyone's interested, I'll get you the source. That's showing that as per capita income increases, so too does rule of law tend to increase. And slowly, I think we're starting to see some of this in some sub-Saharan African countries. Although this is a very difficult issue and maybe one of the most challenging issues moving forward. I'm actually going to, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be like gender insensitive, but I'm going to skip that for the sake of time and just say there is more and more attention being paid to recognizing the important role that women play in African economies and trying to change laws actually to enable them to do more and better in the formal sector. But there are concerns. I mean, I'm painting a rosy picture, and I think there's a lot to be really happy about in sub-Saharan Africa, but there are areas where there are concerns. One of the major concerns is in agriculture. There's a very strong push by all donors today to increase food security in sub-Saharan Africa, to make it, to try to help give people the sort of nutritional inputs that they need so that they're not starving, they grow healthy, their kids are healthy, they suffer less from diseases. But there are a whole set of problems around the agricultural sector that are going to be challenging to fix. The issue that I work on mostly is land and sorting out who owns which land, who has what rights to land, and how to provide real security for folks holding rights is extremely difficult. It's a very political issue in many countries. And so a real challenge, especially when you come face to face with vested interests who actually prefer property insecurity to an environment where there's property security. Another key concern in sub-Saharan Africa is that there are virtually no warehousing facilities. So even if you are a terrific farmer and you grow a great maize crop, you have to put it usually in your barn or at a krell on your property. There's no modern facility for you to take it to, and you're going to lose 30% of your crop or more doing that. And that's an unfortunate loss and makes it much more difficult for people to succeed in that sector. And you can see what some of the other concerns are. There's a lot of talk about a new green revolution in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's a lot of emphasis being placed on getting better seeds and better inputs to people. But if people at the same time don't have access to credit, don't have security over their property, providing them with a bunch of inputs probably isn't going to have the success that some folks are hoping for. Here's a real problem, though: infrastructure. It's very hard to get around in Africa. If you want to get from, let's say, South Africa to Rwanda, you can't. It's going to be very hard to go directly. Actually, maybe you could do that flight directly. But for a lot of countries, the flight routes are terrible. The structure for airlines is really bad. They're the most unsafe region for air travel in the world. Costs are really high. The roads stink. There's no power. If you leave Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, in the nighttime, you drive 4 kilometers out of the city, you're plunged into darkness. And it's going to be the same in virtually every capital city in sub-Saharan Africa, a couple of exceptions, but not many. So there's a huge interest in, a huge demand for infrastructure. Well, infrastructure is really expensive. And so figuring out how does that get built is a real challenge. Some countries are spending lots of money on the ground themselves to develop their infrastructure. China's doing a lot on the ground in Africa to support infrastructure development. And official development assistance is providing kind of a tiny fraction. So you might think that the United States or Great Britain or the other donors are providing lots of money for infrastructure. It's actually a pretty small percentage that's going towards those needs. In some cases because the humanitarian needs are still quite significant. But unless this issue is addressed effectively, it's going to hinder further economic growth in this area. The extractive industry section is a bit of a problem. This is where most of the corruption, if you were looking for large-scale corruption in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of it is circling around these industries, oil, minerals, getting the stuff out of the ground. Here's something that maybe you don't think about a whole lot, subsurface wealth. Who owns that here in the US? Let's say, what's your name? Yasmin. Let's say Yasmin owns 10 acres of land halfway on the way to Charlottesville. And she's like Jed Clampett one day. She's digging in her garden because she wants to plant some tomatoes, and up from the ground comes a bubbling crude. And it turns out you've got oil on your land. Who owns that oil? Don't guess. It's okay. You do. You do. That is not the case in most of the rest of the world. In most of the rest of the world, if Jasmine is doing her garden and up comes the bubble and crude, the government's going to come in and say, oh, well, great, we're so glad that you found that. And now we're going to write a concession to give Exxon the rights to get that oil out of your ground. And you may or may not get any sort of benefit from having Exxon excavate your ground because the government owns the rights to subsurface wealth. Creates all sorts of problems. And really, again, although it's driving growth in some countries, it's almost never the case in Africa that resource-wealthy countries, there are some exceptions, but it's almost never the case that resource-wealthy countries are able to translate their wealth into benefits for their citizens. In fact, oftentimes just the opposite happens. Citizens become more impoverished in those countries. So what are some of the large-scale red flags that would make us a little bit more cautious about my happy story about sub-Saharan Africa? Well, there are a couple of significant red flags, and I was just talking about corruption. I always focus on the governance issue. This is a very difficult issue to tackle, but maybe slowly through some of the new institutional processes that Africans themselves are creating, such as there's a process to review what African governments are doing at the African Union level. Maybe slowly, some progress is being made on that front to try to increase government accountability, increase the transparency of what governments are doing, improve the civil liberties and the civil rights of citizens on the ground, but it's kind of this is a slow go. I should say it was a really slow go in the West too, right? We just shouldn't assume that this was an easy thing for us to do. It took centuries for us to do this as well. But it is going slowly. We've already talked about the infrastructure issues. Maybe the thing to highlight here is the educational issue. There is a huge need for improvements in the educational system in all the sub-Saharan countries. And this is an interesting area where there's been some very cool entrepreneurship focused on providing education that's more targeted for very poor families. And if you're interested in that issue, there's a scholar named James Tooley who's done a lot of work looking at what sort of private sector solutions to educational concerns exist in areas like Lagos and Nairobi. So what are the future prospects for sub-Saharan Africa? Well, I actually think they're pretty good. I'm sort of cautiously optimistic. There is a need to improve governance on the ground, and there's still this need to deal with the rule of law problems. There are still too many government leaders who turn into big men. They come into power, you think they're going to be gone after 8 years, and they're there 28 years later. Uganda is an example of that. It may be the case that Rwanda is going to turn into an example like that. But I think there are reasons to be optimistic. I think the regional integration bodes very well for sub-Saharan Africa. I think rather than if you were to look at a map of trading agreements among the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Until recently, it looked like a bowl of spaghetti. There were lines and ties and this and that, and very little in the way of clarity. So lots of high transactions costs associated with doing business in that region, but those transactions costs are coming down rapidly. Over the last couple of years, African countries have made dramatic improvements on the World Bank's doing business rankings. They've been some of the top performers over the past 6 to 7 years. Rwanda, for example, has been a top performer for 2 years, all focused on trying to make it easier for entrepreneurs to do what they do. And I think there is some hope for agricultural productivity to increase. It really can't get worse. It's so bad in Africa, it can only get better, and there's a lot of attention now being paid to trying to make that happen. So I think there are reasons to be cautiously optimistic. And if not even cautiously optimistic, really almost embrace and celebrate the good news that is. So often we hear the bad news. Maybe it's time and maybe it's appropriate to take a moment and really celebrate the good news. And the good news is that for a lot of people, millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa, life is getting better. They're a little bit more prosperous than they were in the past. Some of their institutions, vital institutions that we take for granted, like the government actually operating an impartial court system, some of those institutions are slowly improving, and that's really important. People are trading more, not only with themselves among Africans, but with the rest of the world, so they're able to export their entrepreneurial ideas, and they're exposed to ideas that they might not have been exposed to before. They're exposed to new ways of doing things. More human capital is brought into the area. And as I talked about earlier, the middle class is growing. I'm going to say something that I probably shouldn't because I'm not a political scientist. So whoever's a political scientist in the room, just close your ears right now. Because I'm going to say something that seems right to me, but probably is wrong actually. But it seems right. It seems like having a middle class is an important thing. Because a middle class seems like they start to once you have a little bit of resource, a little bit of assets, some few assets, it seems like you want to not only protect those assets, but ensure that your kids have those assets as well. And so maybe what's exciting about the growth of a middle class in sub-Saharan Africa is not so much that they have more money to spend on fancy Procter & Gamble shampoos or on coffee bars in Kigali. Maybe what's exciting is that they'll actually start demanding better services and more accountability from their leaders. And it's not going to come from the United States government saying, do a better job, President Kagame. It's going to come from Rwandans also saying, do a better job, President Kagame. So are there concerns in Africa? Yeah, there are a lot of concerns. 750 people on the verge of starvation is a big concern. It's a big concern. Warlords fighting over access to minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo is a big concern. Loss of wildlife biodiversity in a variety of areas because there's land grabbing going on and we're losing valuable biomes and people are getting thrown off their land at the same time, it's a concern. It's not all a rosy picture, but I say compared to 10 years ago, Africa has in fact turned a corner. Whether they can keep going around the corner in the direction that we all hope they go in, or whether they actually backtrack and detour a bit remains to be seen. But I think you'd be surprised if you were to travel with me to Africa today. I think you'd see an Africa that you wouldn't expect, and that's a terrific thing. So I'm going to end there, and I'd be very happy to take your questions. Thank you. So the land grab phenomenon is definitely happening. It's been hard to get accurate data on precisely how much land is being diverted away from communities. I think there are two things to say about land grabbing. The first is that the lands, so here's another thing about the environment in Africa. In most sub-Saharan African countries, the government owns all the land. It would be like, you know how in the western states, the federal government owns a lot of the land, but it doesn't own everything, right? In over 20 African countries, the government owns everything. So you can get leasehold rights, Or you may have customary rights to be on land, but there's nothing like the kind of freehold, fee simple land ownership that we're used to in the United States. Now, I have to say, it's not necessarily a bad thing that government owns land. The government owns the land in Singapore, and no one's worried that things are crumbling in Singapore. But that government enforces rights and is careful about protecting rights to property. So backtrack to land grabbing. Land grabbing is going on. It happens when the government enters into opaque agreements with folks from outside. Sometimes it's domestic investors. We actually don't know how much of it is domestic investors, but a lot of times it's foreigners coming in. So why are foreigners trying to get land in Africa? Because fertile land is an increasingly scarce resource. And countries in the Middle East need land to feed their citizens, and they're facing water constraints. And countries like South Korea have a growing, demanding population who want a secure source of food. And so the South Koreans are looking to buy land. So it's not just the Chinese. It's sovereign wealth funds from the Middle East. It is the Chinese in part, but it's countries like South Korea going in and buying tens or hundreds of thousands of hectares, buying lease rights to tens or thousands of hectares. There was a company in Texas that acquired rights to 600,000 hectares of land in South Sudan 2 years ago for the equivalent of something like $25,000. Acquired a 25-year lease for 600,000 hectares. A hectare is 2 acres. So over 1 million acres of land for $25,000. And the local community had no voice, no participation in the process. When the government changed earlier this summer, the government was then able to reject that concession. So it is definitely going on, and I think what's essential in the case of land grabbing is to work, it's got to happen now. Be working with communities to identify what are their rights on the ground so that they can be in a better position to negotiate directly with investors when they choose to. I think it's not the case that we don't want to say no investment in these areas. These people need investment. But they need not to be taken advantage of. And right now they're being taken advantage of because they have no voice in the bargaining process.
One of the frustrations and one of the promising signs you brought up was leadership and leaders in Africa. So the question is, how do you reward good leaders and get rid of the kleptocrats?
Well, so that's a really tough question, right? And the approach to date has been through the Mo Ibrahim Foundation's it's biannual prize. Are you guys familiar with the Ibrahim Foundation? The Mo Ibrahim Foundation. It's M-O, Ibrahim, I-B-R-A-H-I-M. The Mo Ibrahim Foundation, set up by a Sudanese billionaire named Mo Ibrahim. And his idea was the way to encourage better governance is to reward good governance. And so he's created a prize that's the most valuable prize that's given in the world today. It's more valuable than the Nobel and whatever the fancy mathematics prize is that the math may be the second most valuable prize. But it's a $5 million prize that will be paid to the African leader who does the best job of governing his citizens and then voluntarily stepping down from power. So it's a carrot, right, for good governance? Except the problem is it's $5 million. And that's great. I mean, it's a really nice idea, but it's just not enough money. And so it's only been awarded twice, and I think it's been around for maybe 5 or 6 years now, because last year they couldn't find anyone to give it to. So this is a real challenge. The way the African Union thinks about dealing with this problem is by having peer review of all the leaders in the African Union. So good governments then can review bad governments and say, you're kind of messing up over here, fix this in order to improve the governance. Leadership is, but I'll say this, in the places where you go in sub-Saharan Africa where things do work well, everybody points to the leadership as the key to their success. So whether it's Botswana or Mauritius, even in Namibia, if you talk to people on the ground and say, how come your country's different? Why are things better here in Botswana than they are right next door in Zimbabwe? And everyone will say, it's because of our first president. He was a great leader, and he understood that the government could take advantage of us if he wasn't careful. And he's the one who helped put into place the constraints that have really limited the ability of our government to be predatory. Exact same story you'll hear in Mauritius if you go there. Mauritius was one of the poorest countries in the world in the 1960s. Today it's a middle-income country. It went from being an economic basket case to being a tremendous success story. And for a variety of reasons, a lot of institutions have been improved. Their economic policies have been robust and good. But everyone in that country points back to their first president and says, he was a great man. He really did the right things. He made sure that we weren't taken advantage of. But how you get other countries to follow that example when there's so much to be had if you are governing, and so much to be had from being someone in power, so much wealth to spread to people who are your allies, that limiting that is tough. Yes, sir?
Well, maybe 5 million is enough to basically govern well, but how about 1 million to the people who can kill the most bad leaders?
No comment. Anyone else?
Yes, it's really refreshing to hear somebody being so positive about Africa. So I'm not saying that ironically, but I think I haven't heard that in a long, long time. I've got 2 issues, though. You seem to put the arrival of Walmart in Africa in a positive light. And some of us are very nervous of Walmart because I don't think you can find any track history of Walmart creating a lot of good jobs, middle-class jobs. But that's one issue. The second issue I would like to raise is I don't think I heard in your comments the fact that Africa is a very young country where I believe 60 to 80% of the population is under the age of 30. So how do you factor this in your optimism? Thanks.
Thank you. So let me start with the second question first. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's an extremely young region. And so the folks who are young are going to be looking for jobs, and they're going to be needing opportunities. And so it's even more important that they get a decent education. It's even more important that the economic growth that's been taking place continues, expands. It's even more important that they have access to markets so that they can use their entrepreneurial skills and succeed. So it's really incumbent upon the leaders in those countries, to be wise and look at what those young folks need, because if they don't, societies explode when young people don't have things to do, when they have no good opportunities. It happens over and over again. So you're right, I didn't mention that, and I should have. That is an issue. In terms of the Walmart example, yeah, there are lots of people who are worried about Walmart being in South Africa. Walmart is not a unionized, is not going to be unionized, and I don't think they're going to be unionized. And the South African unions are very worried about the expansion of Walmart into the country. But I guess I would look at the Walmart case this way. So if Walmart's making a bet, it's saying, look, we think we can grow and expand there. They wouldn't be there if they didn't think it was a decent bet. And they will provide some jobs. And in South Africa, anyway, by the current narrow definition of unemployment, I think the unemployment rate is probably hovering around 23%. And if you factor in the folks who are discouraged and have stopped looking for work, it's probably about 39%. And it's been that way for over a decade, maybe 15 years now, maybe basically since the transition from the apartheid-era government to the ANC-led government. So maybe having some job is better than having no job for people. And it may not be that those are middle-class jobs, but maybe they're a stepping stone in the direction for some people who will gain skills, who will at least get a working history, and who will be able to go on and do other things in their lives. Because right now there are entirely too many people in South Africa who have no job at all and who don't have really good prospects for jobs. So is it ideal? Nope, absolutely not. But it's better. It may be better than the alternative. So we have one more question? Chris.
A couple of years ago, Paul Romer, an economist, made sort of a stir by
And the idea was you would get some voluntary consent from the government to try a different set of rules in their country that might be more conducive to the resident. I know you have sort of two hats right now. You have yourself and you have USAID. Can you tell us anything about how that idea is doing in the U.S. government and then you want it?
I haven't seen any USG efforts in that direction so far. It's not that they're not happening, I just haven't seen any. On the private side, though, I know of at least 2 different examples of folks who are trying to facilitate the development of charter cities, one in Senegal, and you may be familiar with that example. But then also another interesting example that's being promoted out of Guatemala, actually, on Roatan Island in Guatemala. So I think the Roma Charter City idea is really cool. I think it's really cool. But I think it suffers from a fatal flaw, which is that even if you can imagine a leader giving up a sovereign territory to allow the experiment to take place, as soon as the experiment begins to succeed, I don't see whatever stops the sovereign from taking it back and then, and kind of ruining the experiment. So a very, very interesting idea. And, what's nice about it is that it could be modified to fit different situations. But I don't see it moving forward in a robust way today. Thank you. Well, thank you all very much for your attention.
I'm co-director of the Marshall Center with Gary McDowell. I want to thank you very much for coming out today. I, too, am very impressed to see so many of you, and especially so many students. We've never had this many students at a Marshall Center event, and that's exciting. And we want you to come back. I have these wonderful cards at Tenure Trip in the back design, and they have all of our events on them. I'm going to put them up front here. You can pick them up on the way out if you didn't get one. The next event is Gary Nesner on October 6th. He's a former FBI hostage negotiator. So you'll join us for that. This was the first talk in the series, and Karol Boudreaux got us off to a wonderful start. So let's please thank her for that. But we're not finished. We have a reception in the Holly Myers Lounge.